Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, the youth unemployment rate really made headlines when it was released earlier this year. But for those who work in sectors like yours, the numbers wouldn't have been a surprise, would it?
Not at all. We've seen the numbers slowly creeping up over a number of years, and very little that seems to have been done seems to have created a dent in that rate.
I take it that is why you decided to do this study, and from what I've read, it wasn't a snap survey. This was done over a long period of time to really try and drill down to the issues at the core of this problem.
Absolutely. We started this in 2012, and at the time the conversation was really about the problem rather than solutions, and we focused on solutions. We worked with 8 youth employability programs, all of which are doing training for young people who struggle to access higher or further education and training through universities and colleges, to try and understand what they were doing to address the youth unemployment problem and how effective they were.
Now, we've heard, for instance, from the presidency, the launch of the YES program that the president has started, which is there to try and help youth to find jobs by making sure those centres are near where they live and not in places that they need to travel to. Your study found that those kinds of interventions, those youth employment programs, are helpful.
Yes.
And we need more of them, I'm sure you're going to say.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we found was that the young people who participated in the program, when we saw them as they entered the program, only 11% of them were employed. By the time we see them 2 years after completing the program, 28% of them were employed. We then matched that sample with a statistically similar sample in the quarterly labour force survey data, and we see that the young people who participate in the programs are approximately 28% more likely to be in employment 2 years after completing the program. And so, yes, we would say that these are critical. They're locally accessible, they're low to no cost for the participants, and they provide a really important resource for young people to navigate the labour market.
From the sounds of it, it creates a very important bridging process for these young people. According to your study, you also found that big gap, speaking of bridging, that big gap between youth who graduate and come from more privileged backgrounds and those who come from poorer socio-economic backgrounds. It's a no-brainer that the one set of young people would find it easier to transition into a working space and start their career, as opposed to those who perhaps are the first to be educated and the first to get a job in a more corporate environment, for example.
Absolutely. And the young people who participate in these programs typically do come from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds. And it's a really important connection point for them because they're unlikely to go through the more formal mechanisms towards employment. And research, not just our own, but a number of other researchers have shown how difficult that labour market transition is for them. It's a staggered one. It's one where they might find a little bit of casual work and then go back into unemployment. High rates of discouragement. So these interventions are absolutely critical in a very difficult labour market.
That high rate of discouragement seems to be one that hasn't been spoken of until these last few months, where we look at these numbers of young people who are unemployed, but it doesn't reflect on those who have actually just given up.
Yes, and what we see, so when we look at the youth unemployment rate, we will always look at the broad definition, which includes discouragement. And there we see that we're nearly up to 55% youth unemployment rate. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a steady increase in discouragement rates, which is really worrying. What we see in our study, though, is that young people who participated in these programs, although many of them remain unemployed, they remain orientated towards the labour market. So they're still looking for work, they're still putting in a large number of applications. And
at
that's
a cost
really
as well.
At a cost, and they do come from households that have experienced food insecurity. So there's an issue around costs of work seeking and the cost being a poverty exacerbating process, which makes these kinds of programs that much more important.
The other thing that you speak about in your findings as well is financial capability interventions. And you point to that being something that would be a big help. What do you mean by that?
So what we did, and we were really surprised at the findings here, what we did was we designed a module that taught them about money management and offered them a savings account. out. And what we found was that we randomly assigned them to receive this training or not. And what we found was that those who received the training were 9 percentage points more likely to be employed when we saw them 2 years after completing the training. It's a big number. We were not expecting to see such a big number, and we don't yet understand what the mechanism is. They don't report saving more than the control group. So we think it has to do with other aspects of their training, sense of future, self-esteem, a sense of control over their money. And so we're going to investigate that a little bit more, but it's really exciting.
And now there are many that will take this report and say, oh, you must go to the presidency and speak to government and tell them what they should be doing. Do you think there's enough of a focus on those potential job givers in the corporate and business space, but understanding that when they're looking to wanting to employ younger people, that they cannot just approach them with a blanket approach, and that in South Africa we're dealing with young people entering a workforce that come from different backgrounds and have different challenges?
Absolutely. So with this project, the programs were state programs, civil society and private sector, and we have seen the private sector come to the party on the youth unemployment issues, and perhaps a little belatedly, but we are starting to see a number of big employers beginning to understand the challenge and beginning to understand different ways of recruiting and employing young people, and especially the kind of support that young people need to be onboarded into a job and to stay in that job.
Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa is addressing his State of the Nation address on Thursday. Loads expected about what he's going to say about this huge unemployment rate, with young people making up about 50% of that number. If you were able to have a conversation with him, what would you say are the two major things he needs to look at if they are going to try to make a dent on this number?
Well, firstly, I think it has to do with labour absorptive growth, so creating more jobs. But I think even in a context where we had job growth, you would still have huge numbers of young people who face significant barriers to the labour market. And these kinds of interventions for them are absolutely critical. So invest in them, help them to grow so that more young people can
And remove some of those barriers that are making it impossible for them to even just get a start, I suppose.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That's Lauren Graham, Associate Professor for the Centre for Social Development in Africa at the University of Johannesburg. Fascinating findings of the Siyakha Youth Assets Study. Thank you so much for coming to tell us more about it.